welcome back to the Washington Outsider. Today we have an exciting program dedicated to analyzing and examining Egypt's growing role in Africa. We will look at the diplomatic opportunities that Egypt is faced with today, both in Africa and outside of it, as well as challenges and opportunities in defense. With us today are Simone Ledeen and Mohammed Ladie. And, Mohammed will speak to the diplomatic aspect of the situation, followed by Simone's remarks about the defense. What challenges is Egypt facing from its various fronts? Following the end of the remarks, I will moderate a discussion about the many questions arising in this part of the world. And as you know, my name is Irina Tsukerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. This is part of our geopolitical series. And Mohammed, please feel free to start.
Okay. Thank you very much, Irina, for this invitation and this opportunity to express what's going in Egypt about the new direction to Africa, especially Sub-Saharan African countries that was neglected for many years during the ex-president Mr. Mubarak. I hope to concentrate in how Egypt started after 2014 to give big interest to the Sub-Saharan African countries and why this happened. This happened because of the Nile water issues and also because of the economic booming in Egypt, the need to new markets to make the Egyptian products look in this markets, especially the African markets. So I prepared some ideas and I like to shed light on them about the relation between Egypt and the Sub-Saharan African countries that developed over the past 7 years after Mr. President Sisi came to power, driven by the Nile water issue and also by the country's mounting interest in regional integration and the search for new economic opportunities. It is obvious that the Egyptian-African relations witnessed now unprecedented boom because of the new direction of Egypt and its political diplomacy to both ties with all African countries. We will notice that Mr. Sisi's official visits were, half of them were for African countries. It hasn't happened before for any Egyptian leader to visit all these countries. Also, we have a new strategy for Egyptian. We called it infrastructure diplomacy. We will notice that the private sector plays a major role in fostering these relations through major development projects launched within Egyptian membership to the Presidential Initiative for African Infrastructure Development. The Egyptian private sector is implementing some vital projects in Africa, covering many sectors, including transport and water resources. For example, the Arab Contractors Company, we called it in Arabic Al-Muqawwalun Al-Arab, implements projects in 23 African countries in various fields of infrastructure with investment of more than 1.5 billion US dollars. And also we have another strategy for building dams for some countries, like in Tanzania, this dam, Julius Nyerere Dam in Tanzania. And also there is another kind of infrastructure diplomacy called subsea cables diplomacy that Egypt, another company called Telecom Egypt, is planning to connect landlocked and coastal African countries to Europe through a giant subsea system that will circle all of Africa. This hybrid African ring pass with Telecom Egypt is set to complete by 2023. Will form the two main arteries that will begin from a landing point in South Africa, 2 points in 3 southern European countries. Egypt will be a hub for internet submarine cables from these African countries, with a total of 13 cables landing in the country. And it's already a hub for internet for the international cables. Also, Egypt is undertaking now efforts to increase investments across Africa and to boost trade with its African partners. There is also a project that is planned to be inaugurated recently. It's called the Cairo Cape Town Highway. It will cross all Eastern African countries till it reaches South Africa. I will move to another point, is that why Egypt does that. Egypt does that. Egypt wants to be a gateway to Africa, to Europe. And Egypt is working to secure its position as a gateway for African by focusing on bilateral efforts on specific issues. Now there is the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that signed last year, and this agreement will allow Egypt to put a lot of products in the African countries. Also, Egypt wants to be an energy hub for the African countries. Egypt took a step towards an energy hub with the completion of connecting between Egypt and Sudan in electricity grid through the Toshka substation in early 2019. This allows Egypt to supply a maximum of about 40 megawatt to Khartoum. As I told you in the beginning of my comment, that was happened because of the Nile issue, and also the need to find a new market for the Egyptian products, which is suitable to African markets, as the quality and the price is suitable for African markets. But the Nile water issue was one of the main causes that Egypt wanted to cooperate with African countries, or to concentrate in relation with African countries. The Nile water issue was one of the main dimensions of the reapproachment between Egypt and East Africa. The Egyptian government has also worked to strengthen relations with the Nile Basin countries. To this end, Egypt has sought stronger bilateral ties with these countries and more active involvement in regional organization. A diplomatic campaign was put in place, including several presidential visits to Sudan, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, as well as hosting many African events. And finally, Mr. President visited Djibouti too. Also for Egypt soft power, training and scholarship opportunities for military people in Africa. Egypt continues to use its expertise in fight against terrorism and its military capabilities in supporting other African countries by offering training and study scholarship opportunities in Egyptian military colleges. The new directions about economy with other African countries. Egypt has realized that competition in Africa now has to do more with development and economic presence rather than diplomacy and politics. Many African countries see Egypt as being successful in developing the infrastructure they lack and seek to benefit from Egypt's experience. Cairo has recently focused on economic cooperation in terms of trade, development, and the infrastructure projects in its policy in East Africa and the Horn of Africa. Egypt has signed many trade agreements with African countries, such as the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, in addition to the African Continental Free Trade, and has established a risk insurance fund on exports to Africa. By the end of 2020, Cairo announced a plan to increase Egyptian exports to African countries with a goal of reaching $30 billion within 3 years. For logistics, as you know, Egypt, Africa lacks infrastructure. So the Egyptian president instructed government in 2019 to establish direct lines between Egyptian ports and the other ports on Africa's coast. Established a risk insurance fund for exports to Africa, and also Egypt planned to inaugurate Cairo Cape Town highway. My recommendations for the Egyptian African trade. One of the initial challenges to boosting Egyptian African trade will be to expand and strengthen export, financing, and monetary infrastructure between Egypt and the African countries in order to mitigate risk and encourage companies to take advantage of the opportunities available. In addition to the financial and the technical framework, the development of the physical logistics infrastructure and the internet connection will likewise be an early hurdle to boosting long-term trade on the continent. My conclusion for this point: Egypt clearly has a growing interest in Sub-Saharan Africa, as shown by its increased involvement in initiatives for regional and mounting diplomatic exchanges with Sub-Saharan countries. This shift has been driven by the Nile water issue and also by the country's search for new economic opportunities. Egypt needs to increase the number of Egyptian companies and logistical centers and to organize comprehensive commercial delegations to Africa. So this was my first paper about Egypt and African trade and the direction towards Africa. The defense little talk about lately. So the other guest can. Okay.
Thank you, Mohammed. That was Mohammed Ladie, the editor-in-chief of Sada and Balad. And now we turn to Simone Ledeen, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, North Africa. Defense. Sorry. Oh my gosh, sorry, defense. And we actually, I wanted to address some of the key defense issues that are facing Egypt today. Some of them are stemming from the attempts from diplomatic crisis, but are quickly turning into defense issues, such as what we are seeing with the GRD, the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, that is threatening a major humanitarian crisis in both Egypt and Sudan. And we are also seeing that Egypt is trying to deal with that major crisis while also facing continuing threats in Sinai, an unresolved situation in Libya, while attempting to also deal with potential threats in the Red Sea. Simone, if you could comment briefly on where are you seeing all of this going? Will Egypt manage to navigate the diplomatic issue from the crisis with Ethiopia, or is Ethiopia's intransigence lead to a defense standoff? Is there going to be a war, in other words, in your opinion?
Well, I think, Irina, thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me. And Mohammed, it was really great to hear your comments. Thank you. I think that the more time passes and the more the GRD is filled by the Ethiopians, the closer this situation lurches toward a military confrontation. Just to put a fine point on it, Egypt depends on the Nile for more than 90% of its freshwater needs. So any significant cut in Egypt's share of the Nile water could really, as you mentioned, cause a real humanitarian catastrophe, wipe out hundreds of thousands of jobs and in the agriculture sector, and potentially lead to food shortages as well. Sudan, I think it's worth noting, also faces a threat of flooding if Ethiopia doesn't coordinate the way that it needs to on the filling of the dam. And I know the Sudan is also concerned about power generation dams on the Nile. I think for these reasons, Egypt has been rightly so very focused on re-engaging in Africa, in particular with the Nile Basin countries, in order to try to avoid an unfortunate military intervention, which, as I said, is looking increasingly likely. If you look back to, I believe it was May, where Egypt and the Sudan had joint military exercises, I think the language that was used during those exercises was very clear, that they didn't name any country in particular, but they said if we feel threatened, we will be forced to act. And I believe, unfortunately, again, the more time passes and this doesn't get resolved, and the GRD continues to be filled without a diplomatic solution, I personally am concerned that we will see military intervention. Egypt will feel pushed into a corner.
And in the instance that that becomes a possibility, how do you see other countries in the region, such as Kenya, where are they going to stand on this issue? Are they going to be drawn into that potential conflict? What kind of intervention would we be looking at? Would it be a targeted strike against the dam? Would that follow into a more protracted confrontation with Ethiopia? How do you see that possibility playing out?
Well, I certainly hope that there will not be a military confrontation, and I hope that everybody collectively continues to work toward a different outcome. But Egypt has been very busy securing agreements, technical agreements, defense cooperation agreements, military intelligence sharing agreements with the Nile Basin countries, including Kenya. So back in May, Egypt and Kenya signed a technical agreement for defense cooperation. It's not being on the inside to know all of the details of what that defense cooperation entails. I know that the reason for these types of engagements, and this isn't the only, as I mentioned, the only agreement that Egypt has reached with a Nile Basin country, it is specifically to send the signal to Ethiopia that Egypt is back on the African continent. They have influence. They have significant military and economic agreements, not just with Ethiopia, but also Uganda, Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, and Djibouti, as I believe Mohammed mentioned earlier. So all of these agreements, I think, are meant to show Ethiopia that, in fact, Egypt does wield a large amount of influence on the African continent, and that ceasing diplomatic engagement and focusing on a potential military outcome would not be beneficial to Ethiopia. I think that's clearly what Egypt is messaging, and not knowing the specific details of these agreements, it's hard to say, would Kenya potentially support Egypt in a military confrontation? I couldn't predict that. I don't know where each of these countries would fall, but it is clear that there is a great deal of cooperation ongoing, and the economic benefits that Egypt wants to bring to these countries are potentially significant enough that Ethiopia would have trouble competing. So I think for all of these reasons, diplomacy is diplomacy is a much preferred outcome in this as we get closer and closer to a potential military outcome.
Just to follow up quickly on that, and then I'll turn to Mohammed with some additional questions. Ethiopia is facing an internal crisis of its own. It has invaded a restive province of Tigray. It has it has been accused of various abuses against civilians in the process of resolving that situation. There's been discussion of Eritrean forces entering the country and helping Ethiopian federal forces against to put down the uprising. And there's also been a discussion of a potential spillover into neighboring countries. So Ethiopia is facing another internal crisis that has nothing to do with this issue, and yet keeps pushing the possibility of a confrontation with Egypt closer and closer. Isn't it in its best interest to come to a diplomatic solution, at least on one front, and win international goodwill that way, rather than finding itself encumbered by multiple front war? Why is the Ethiopian leadership pursuing this particular course of action that's not likely to lead to any place good?
That's a great question, Irina. I will give you my opinion. I'm really interested to hear what Mohammed thinks as well. In my view, I believe that Ethiopia feels emboldened by the positions of both the UAE and Russia regarding the GRD Nile Dam dispute. I think Egypt is concerned about this, and Ethiopia feels a little bit emboldened because they feel supported by these countries. I don't think that certainly the partnership that Egypt shares with UAE and also Russia, I don't think that their stance on this specific issue will actually derail their overall partnerships and relationships. But I do think that as these countries are trying to balance their interests on the continent, it is signaling to Ethiopia that perhaps they have support and would be supported in the event of a military outcome, which is unfortunate because the last thing that the African continent needs is more conflict, more armed conflict. So, but I do think that is playing a very large role right now in the calculus of Ethiopia in terms of moving forward and continuing to fill the dam. And I agree with you. I mean, Ethiopia it continues to send National Guard units to fight against terrorism in the northern Tigray region. You know, there's whispers of Egyptian backing for the TPLF, and so you know, there are many people who are sort of dealing with these as two separate issues, but then there are also many people who view them as one and the same. That is also stoking the flames quite a bit towards, you know, fanning the flames toward an unfortunate potential military outcome.
I could definitely see it. There is, on the one hand, when you have any sort of internal chaos, your adversaries will take advantage of that. On the other hand, when you are unable to deal with internal issues, you use external enemies such as Egypt as a potential scapegoat and only create increasing crisis. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating crisis, and I don't really see how one could be fully resolved without also addressing the other. But perhaps Mohammed can address that, and also to follow up. Egypt voices from Egypt have been increasingly critical of Russia's attitude with this issue. With UAE, it's been a little bit more complicated. Egypt has kind of a situation in Libya with UAE where there's been, on the one hand, some level of tension, but on the other hand, some level of supportive cooperation, and that's another front that Egypt needs to be careful about. How do you see this diplomatic/defense issue playing out. Russia has also been playing a role in Libya that everyone been somewhat critical about, but it also appears to be kind of unavoidable. So how does Egypt deal with these complications of allies/frenemies and competitors kind of enmeshed in its multiple security issues?
Yeah. In Egypt, a lot of experts are worried about the Russian situation in some cases, especially in Libya, and you said now, and also during al-Bashir's reign in Sudan, there should be a naval base near the Egyptian borders in Sudan, and also there is, as you know, like a competition between Egypt after the discoveries of the gases in the Mediterranean. A lot of experts said that the Russians are playing a hidden role in some cases. So we didn't astonished when the Ethiopians announced that they had a deal with the Russian to export to import weapons. A lot of big countries, if you offered them money, so why not? Especially the Russians, because there is like an contradiction between a lot of interests between Egypt and Russia. As I told you, the gas, and also until now the Russian tourism didn't get back. Even President Putin announced many times that should be back, but we are waiting now. The back of the Russian tourism to Egypt. So I think if the Ethiopians have the money, they would have the weapons to make the struggle in the Nile continue for years, not for signing only a deal between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia. But if the Ethiopians found the weapons, I think there is no political will to sign any agreements with the other countries. As the world see in the United Nations Security Council, that the Ethiopians are stubborn. They refused to sign any binding agreement with Egypt and Sudan. So the Russians rule, we are weird about it.
Just to follow up on this situation, going back to UAE again slightly, both UAE and Saudi Arabia offered mediation services, so to speak, in resolving this crisis. But the simplest way to achieve any sort of breakthrough would seem to persuade Ethiopians to accept Egypt's offers of providing electricity, which was the whole point of the dam to begin with, and to pay for infrastructure that throughout Ethiopia that would make that would facilitate that move. Why isn't that happening? Why do we not see UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others who claim to be which positioned for peaceful resolution due to their strong relationships with both countries? Why aren't they doing more beyond just purely diplomatic back and forth, which has not persuaded Ethiopia thus far? Where is the financial commitment that it takes to actually resolve this crisis?
I think Ethiopia itself refused any mediation from any other countries like Saudi Arabia, Emirates. They refused. They as you said that they always search for external enemy to redeem their internal problems. So the Ethiopians themselves, or the Ethiopian leaders, want to to always have this issue to make the country unit, as there are a lot of struggles between the components of this country, Amhara, Muslims, Tigray, many components in this country. So if they find always an external enemy, so they hope the leaders of Ethiopia hope to find this enemy to make the country unite. The Saudi Arabia tried to mediate, and they announced their support for Egypt and Sudan, but with no results. Ethiopia refused. Also, many countries, the Qatar always also offered help during the ministerial meeting in Doha, but until now, no signs of acceptance from the Ethiopian side. The Egyptian strategy, as I said, for trade, I have another paper about the defense strategy in Africa, but the Egyptian strategy for Ethiopia, as you see, we are now like make a circle around Ethiopia. All the countries that have borders with Ethiopia, we have made the agreements, intelligence agreements, the defense agreements, cooperation agreements with all the countries that are around Ethiopia. So the only country we don't have, as Egyptian, don't have agreements with it is Ethiopia itself. So I think now, after the second fill of the GERD happened, Ethiopia should search for diplomacy, as they fulfill what they want, as they refused all the wallet push or the wallet war with the pressure. They refused all the pressures from the big countries like USA, like the European countries. They refused all this pressure, and now they should make a deal, a diplomatic deal, or a binding agreement with Egypt and Sudan. They should do that after they fulfill what they want. And as we read yesterday, the second fill happened, even it wasn't less than 7 billion cubic meters, but it happened as they want. Okay.
Just to clarify, is this correct that all these countries, the GCC states, US, European Union, have they actually offered some sort of financial incentive to stop the filling and to perhaps create alternative options for energy fields? Have they offered to build that or to finance the building of infrastructure that would allow electrical imports from Egypt and other places? Or were all these diplomatic efforts focused on something else? I'm just trying to understand exactly what was going on and what was offered.
Excuse me, which country offered Egypt, or?
No. Whether the GCC states attempting to mediate, or US or European Union, have any of them offered to finance alternative infrastructure, alternative to the dam that would allow Egypt or others to import?
No. None of them offered the financial support or for Ethiopia. As it was declared, they only want to go back to the table of to negotiate about the gap. No offer, no offer or financial offer. Only they advised the Ethiopians to go back to negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
So no one offered money, even Saudi Arabia, even UAE, even
Well,
Qatar offer to assume.
to be honest with you, that does not seem to be like a particularly effective negotiating position if there's nothing on the table other than the same arguments that fell before. I don't really see how that's going to proceed. Essentially, the Ethiopian government's position to the people, and it may not be wholly accurate, but it is something that speaks to the population, is that we need X amount of energy. We can't afford it any other way. We can't import electricity because we don't have the infrastructure for it. So this is the only way for us to get what we need. And saying that it hurts other countries, well, our interest come first. That's the argument. Why, and trying to argue around it may be has proven to be ineffective, even if it's the correct position to take. So I'm not really sure why is it that all these countries are not offering that potential argument that could make some sort of a dent, or just make it harder for Ethiopians to maintain their position. It's one thing when there's no alternatives, but if they have viable alternatives, it's harder to make the argument that they need that particular thing at that particular rate. So it seems to me, I feel like I'm missing something from the diplomatic angle here. Why these countries that all have an incentive in seeing a diplomatic resolution and seeing everybody win are not doing the one and only thing that could, create that possibility, which is financial investment into in resolving the underlying energy issue. That seems to me a little bit unclear. Now to shift back to Simone a little bit, I've been in this is kind of the last thing on the Ethiopia issue, but I did find it very interesting that I've been hearing that Ethiopians are making a religious argument about this, and have been trying to turn an economic, riparian, territorial argument into a religious sort of crusade slash jihad, which is it most certainly is not. And they've been basically saying, well, Christian states should stand with us as a Christian country surrounded by Muslim states such as Sudan and Egypt, and historically they've done us all these wrongs, blah blah blah. That sort of an argument, and I've seen that argument recently being utilized in the Karabakh War, Second Karabakh War in the Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where Armenia, losing a very short military conflict, was making a big propaganda campaign in the West that there was an active genocide going on against the Christian population, and therefore countries should support and intervene in that conflict. I see that Ethiopia is likely concerned about losing any potential military conflict to Egypt and Sudan should push comes to shove, and is building ground for an external view of being seen as a victim of religious territorial grab, basically. Is that an effective argument? Do you see this coming through in defense circles in the US or elsewhere? And that's too small.
Well, as someone who has a pretty long background in counterterrorism, I have learned to avoid entering into discussions about religion because it never really ends well. So I sort of think bringing religion into any debate will just further inflame the discussion, unfortunately. And perhaps that's the point, I think, as you mentioned earlier. This area is not really within my wheelhouse of expertise, but I would say that certainly calling for religious tensions to be raised is not a path for peace, and I think that speaks for itself.
So shifting gears a little bit from that front to the issues concerning other parts of the other geographic locations of interest, we are looking at the whole situation I'll speak to Mohammed on this, on the diplomatic aspect of it first, and then come back to Simone. We've seen attempts to break through the tensions with Qatar and Turkey. With Qatar, with the Aruba agreement, we've seen the Egyptian Foreign Minister go on Al Jazeera. We've seen some outlets praising Al Jazeera for recognizing Egypt's role in the Gaza-Israel conflict breakthrough. And we've seen some level of economic activity that was being welcomed by Egypt from the Qatar investment side. And there's also been an ongoing attempt to resolve tensions with Turkey with very mixed success. And one of the main points being Turkey's whether Turkey will agree to turn over Muslim Brotherhood Egyptian leaders to Egypt, or whether they will just be temporarily expelled somewhere else. So how do we see this process? Are these countries now playing a more constructive role, or are there many questions remaining about their involvement? Have these diplomatic efforts been largely superficial, or is there any substantive improvement from the security side and from diplomatic side? And I'll start with Mohammed and then turn to the defense aspect of this issue. Mohammed?
Excuse me, could you say the question again, because the internet was not good.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
I didn't hear it well. Okay.
I was asking about the attempted improvements in relations with Qatar following the Al-Ula agreement, and with Turkey following diplomatic engagement. And I was basically saying that we've seen the Egyptian foreign minister go on Al Jazeera. We've seen some Egyptian publications praising Al Jazeera for recognizing Egypt's role in the diplomatic breakthrough between Hamas and Israel in the conflict. We've seen some level of Qatari investments in Egypt that's been welcomed, and we've seen also negotiations with Turkey over whether Turkey will expel its Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leaders somewhere or turn them over to Egypt. Has there been any real improvement with these countries, or would you say that this is an effort that's been so far more frustrating than helpful? How would you evaluate the success of these diplomatic engagements?
Yeah, as you see, that Egypt has a vital role in Middle East issues. We have a lot of files that we inherited from the Hosni Mubarak era, or Mr. Sadat era, because all of them was playing a role in peace talks between Egypt and Israel, and also between the Arabs and Israel. And Mr. Sisi inherited this file, and Egypt continues in playing the role of as a peacemaker or peace mediator between the Israelis and Palestinians. These files added to Egyptian role also in Africa, and these files are not separated from the role of Egypt in Africa, as like the Palestinian-Israeli issue, as I sent you yesterday, that the Israel embassy in Cairo announced that we are not Egyptian development. We are supporting Egypt in negotiating with the Ethiopian government. We are not hurt Egypt. So because of the role of Egypt in peace process, or in the good peace process between Egypt and Israel, and also the role Egypt plays in Gaza. So we have good relation with Israel, and even the Israeli foreign minister announced in Brussels that he supports Egypt and he supports Egypt's right to get its water. So all these files reflect on Egyptian Ethiopian struggle. Also, as you said, the Qatari there was a approachment between Egypt, between Cairo and Doha. So immediately, Doha made a conference in Qatar, and all the Arab foreign ministers announced their support to Egypt, and also Doha supports Egypt in the Nile water issue. The negotiation between Turkey and Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, it started and they held the first round, and we are waiting for the second round. And also I met Mr. Chawish Oglu in Tashkanda and asked him about that, and he refused to answer. As you know, there is a will to make to normalize the relation between Egypt and Turkey again. May take some time, but I think this diplomacy of Egypt to be opened to all files and to have a role in all files, that will reflect in Egyptian Ethiopian struggle. And we hope that we could find a good player that could play a role between Egypt and Ethiopia. During Trump Mr. Trump was trying to have Ethiopia to sign on the agreement, but finally Ethiopia refused. We hope to find a player in the international community to play this role and to make Ethiopia go back to the negotiations and make a deal, a binding deal or binding agreement. So that's what. Is there the second question I didn't?
No, that was about that. I was trying to figure out how effective these efforts have been, but as I see, it's had some success and some challenges.
Sorry, because the internet make like a lag or something like that.
No, so I'm going to shift to Simone for a little bit. I want to kind of look at the situation in Libya and elsewhere, where there's been an attempt to eject the foreign militias via the agreement at the Second Berlin Conference, which has come to nothing other than agreement so far. Those militias are still there. We are also seeing that there's an election coming up in December, and that some of the former Sarraj people are campaigning actively in DC for support to their candidacy. So that some of the issues that seem to have been put to rest temporarily with the Muslim Brotherhood, with the Turkish-backed factions, have not been fully resolved. How do you see that playing out from a defense perspective? In the event that pro-Sarraj factions return to full power, do you believe that the tensions with Egypt will return? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I hear that. Sorry.
Simone?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so obviously Libya is on everybody's mind still. The continuing crisis in Libya. I think now we're in a situation, and I know Egypt, I assume they have a very realist view of this, that there's been a lot of hope that the crisis in Libya could finally be resolved after a decade of chaos and violence, but as long as there's disputes about elections and constitutional issues, I don't really see a consensus forming in order to move this forward in a political way. I know, there's still this kind of complex patchwork of militias and mercenaries and foreign powers that would take a lot longer than the time we have remaining to really get into. I don't see all of that just disappearing back into the ether. I think there are several countries that have actually put a lot of money and a lot of sort of blood behind their interests in Libya. And I don't think anybody will just walk away. So unfortunately, it seems like a protracted situation that will not be resolved anytime soon. I hope I'm wrong, by the way. And I actually, hearing myself say that, I try to stay away from predictions in general, having been an intelligence and analyst in a previous life. But it sure doesn't look good. It's so complicated. And again, do you really see these militias just laying down their arms and walking away? I hope so. After a decade of fighting, I hope they do. But we have so many mercenaries there. And I think from Egypt's perspective, the concern is the violent extremists that are there and that have been shipped in there for fighting still present a very real challenge to the government of Egypt and border security and the Egyptian population at large. So I think they have a very strong vested interest. They're one of several countries that does, and continues to push their interests and concerns both overtly through diplomatic means and covertly in many different ways.
So staying away from the predictions, which is at this point is not that easy to do, I wanted to ask you, what do you think should be the strategy for confronting these concerns if there are several entrenched state interests as well as non-state actors that are not completely unintegrated, and if the current political / diplomatic track has appeared to has failed completely to address, much less resolve any of these concerns? What should be done instead, and by whom?
Well, I think so. It is important to note that the overall security situation in Libya has slowly improved. So I think that is a positive. But as we've noted, the progress on other key issues like elections has stalled, as well as this prerequisite for the withdrawal of foreign forces. I think maybe moving forward, I know the UN has estimated that there are like 20,000 foreign forces, including Russian mercenaries, that are still on Libyan territory. I would encourage a focus on that, a focus on also Turkey withdrawing its military. That would be a good start, I believe, in getting to a peaceful and political solution. That said, do I think that will happen? No, I don't. For the reasons that I gave earlier, these interests are entrenched by now. There have been a lot of sacrifices. There's been a lot of money. There have been a lot of losses, both financial and in terms of manpower and fighters. So I think, unfortunately, we could continue to see a protracted, chaotic period with many different foreign interests continuing to play outsized roles in the future of Libya.
Turning back to Mohammed, kind of moving from that issue to a kind of issue of terrorism in general in the region, we are seeing again, as I mentioned, the Sarraj faction trying to get back to the forefront of events, which means potentially greater focus on the Islamist involvement. And we are also seeing that some of the terrorists in Sinai have been, some of the ISIS groups and others have been training in Libya, and we are seeing a flow of weapons into other regions through Libya and back. We are seeing drugs being smuggled through Libya to Europe and to other parts of Africa. What? How do you see that particular? How do you see Egypt handling that particular situation in the event that these interests once again regain political front and not just kind of low level security dimension? Do you see what sort of political effort can Egypt put at this point? What sort of diplomacy can it exercise with respect to Turkey and others that have been empowering these groups? And furthermore, we are seeing the same sort of thing, happening in other areas like Somalia with the Turkish weapons known to be smuggled into the country. I know that Egypt has been um, trying to invest into Somalian infrastructure and so forth. But do you really see these issues being resolved, and so how?
So, as you know, Libya is very important to Egypt, as it was the source of many terrorists who crossed the borders, and they did a lot of terrorist actions inside Egypt. So we are interested in what's going in Libya. And last year, Mr. President Sisi announced the red lines for the Turkish, that no one can cross this red line. And after this red line, we have the political process, and the elections should be during this year, before the end of this year. There will be in the parliamentary elections. So in the military actions, I think the Egyptians are watching the borders, especially these unmanned areas that the terrorists use it to cross the borders. And with yesterday the Egyptian embassy in Tripoli announced that 140 Egyptians will go back to Cairo. The militias inside Libya were abducting them. So this issue is very important, because a lot of Egyptians live there in Libya itself. So the Egyptian workers work there for many years, and the militias, if the militias want to make pressure on the Egyptian government, they kidnap these people, and then they ask for ransom or for something. If the Egyptian government didn't pay, I think they will ask for some benefits from the as a deal between them and the Egyptian government. So the situation in Libya itself is very difficult, very dangerous to Egyptians, and I hope that the Libyans themselves could find a solution. As we read yesterday, that Mr. Haftar could take the eastern part and make announcing an independent country inside Libya. So the situation is not clear till now, but Egypt normalized the relation with the Tripoli government, and they inaugurated the embassy again. So no one knows what's going on inside Libya, and I hope that the Libyans themselves find the solution, and they could choose the right people who could represent them in the parliament. And for the Turkish and for the maybe some other players like Russians, they should put off their hands and go away and let the diplomatic process happen, and then we can find who operate with them in economic projects or something like that. No need to make like military bases as Turkey is now planning to make a military base inside Libya or something like that. Or the Russians make a lot of like Wagner, make a lot of militias like Wagner. So I hope these powers would put off their hands away from Libya.
Turning back to Simone, there has been a discussion about the resurgence of ISIS in Africa. How do you see that playing out? Is we're already seeing some of that in Iraq happening, but do you see that turning into a major quagmire in Africa, or do you see that issue as somewhat overblown and containable?
So it is, the resurgence of ISIS has been happening for some time, primarily in Africa, when they couldn't really gain any ground effectively in Syria, Iraq, the ungoverned region. So we are looking at an absolute resurgence, and in some cases, ISIS controls land in Africa. Mozambique is facing a very dire threat. Absolutely. So I think as we look into the future, the counterterrorism fight against ISIS continues and is very real. It is not overblown, in my opinion, and we will need to keep fighting them in different places. I know from the U.S. perspective, the concern is, are these groups, do they have the desire to hit the United States homeland, and do they have the capability of hitting the United States homeland? I am not sure how the Egyptian government looks at the same threat, and if they would, if they have the same sort of priorities that we do, the same way of sort of gauging, where's the red line where they're actually going to have to put an effort behind it. I know for Egypt, they're facing a big challenge in the Sinai. There's still, there's quite a bit of radicalism and radicalization there. I think they're doing some interesting things, and including some of the development projects that they're planning in the Sinai to increase, move a lot of people out of the cities, move them into Sinai, create, housing and economic opportunities for them. And so I think that's a very interesting idea, and we'll certainly be watching that closely in the future. Perhaps that's something that can be replicated elsewhere if it's successful. But I do think it's important to be honest about the burgeoning ISIS threat on the African continent, and the need for countries to start thinking about how they're going to react, especially as, in the past, the U.S. was there fighting terrorism. And as we all know, the U.S. has mostly left left that fight for the moment, although tomorrow the U.S. could decide to come back, given how they assess the threats. Again, if the threats assessed to have grown enough that it could hit the U.S. homeland, you'll be seeing U.S. troops back there fighting against ISIS. But I think it's something to watch closely, and I think it's something that will continue to grow until there's a sufficient effort put behind stopping it.
Mohammed, turning to you, is there any sort of plan for Egypt and other actors in the area to turn to a countering ideological spread of jihadist, motivations, the same way there's been an internal fight against Muslim Brotherhood through development programs in the outskirts and peripheral areas and so forth. Is there a larger kind of joint plan to counter the factors that contribute to the spread of of the ideology that motivates terrorists, or is it still treated solely as a counter-terrorism issue, simply a tactical response to terrorist groups?
Yes, as you know, Muslim Brotherhood are the source of all ideological ideas that about killing the others and killing innocent people in all the world, especially in Egypt after 2013. They started to boom a lot of buildings and to make a lot of terrorist actions against the Egyptian government, the Egyptian police, and even against the Egyptian people themselves. So there is now like a plan to revise all the old texts, especially from the religious institution in Egypt, like Al-Azhar. They start to revise these texts, old texts that these texts were explained by some evil people or some terrorists that it make it easy to kill the others. So this is one of the steps that the Egyptian government start to take, and also that Saudi Arabia also started also to make the same step, as Prince Mohammed bin Salman announced that about the hadith that the Prophet Muhammad sayings that should be revised too, because some of them were not accredited, and not trusted, and some people made them for themselves to have the execution or to have the permission to kill others. So all these texts start to be revised from big religious institution in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia, as they are the big Muslim countries in the area. This is one of steps. Also, the Egyptian government start to modernize the old outskirts or all the regions that was not planned, because all these outskirts were also the source of the people who could make crimes or make terrorist action, or the religious groups could attract them to be members of it, or especially with the internet. They were make them members of these groups with the internet. As you know, a lot of ISIS or a lot of Muslim Brotherhood are perfect in using these websites that make attraction between the youth to go to Syria, or to go to Sinai, or to go to other places, and then they are trained, and then they became terrorists themselves and kill the others or bomb themselves. So the second step is to modernize all the outskirts and to make it valid for life, valid for suitable life, good buildings, healthy buildings, and also wide streets. Egypt took steps for all these outskirts around Cairo, especially around Cairo, and also in government. This was the second step. The third step was to make economy booming. Like a lot of poor people were also members for these terrorist groups, as when the terrorist groups recruited them, they offered them money. Now there is a lot of small enterprises for this use and for the poor people to make them find jobs in Egypt and be away from these terrorist groups. I hope that also the parliament in Egypt took some steps against the people who are members of Muslim Brotherhood who work in government. The parliament certified this law that make those officials or these clients who work inside government who are members of Muslim Brotherhood, they could be fired because many of them were doing a lot of harmful things inside their jobs that hurt a lot of people, especially these train accidents that happened in Egypt lately, where a lot of Muslim Brotherhood members were some of them were drivers, some of them were responsible for this action. So there is a lot of laws, a lot of steps that the Egyptian government or the Saudi Arabia government start to take to revise or to modernize this old texts, and also I hope that we could in less than 5 years we could make these terrorist actions stop, and especially in Sinai or in other places.
Thank you so much. That certainly seems like a great model to follow. Perhaps in the future we can discuss whether something like that could be implemented on a more regional scale and with other actors' input. But we've had a great discussion today on a wide variety of issues. Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Simone. I hope to see you both very soon. There's no shortage of issues to discuss, fortunately or unfortunately. And hopefully next time we talk, there'll be at least some major positive breakthroughs on at least some of these fronts. But if not, there'll still be a lot to talk about regardless. Thank you both.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Irina. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Irina. Have a good day. Thank you.
You
Nice
too.
to meet you, Simone.